Well, yeah, let's go get started. I am Paul Ortiz, professor of labor history at Cornell, former director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at UF. I'm talking today with Dr. Steve Kirn, who is a retired faculty member at the College of Business. Dr. Kirn actually earned his PhD at the University of Florida. And when I knew you, Steve, you were actually the head of the retail center. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was the
Um,
Center for Retailing Education and Research, which doesn't sound a whole lot like what I got my PhD in, which was in clinical and community psychology. But there's overlap.
there is. And we wanted to talk to you, Dr. Curran. I'll call you Steve if that's okay for the course of the interview. We'll have your biographical information on on the cover sheet. Um, you and I have spoken over the years informally about your time, when you first arrived at UF and the 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 exciting times that were back then. The war protests, the student movements, politics, and I wonder if we could start there. Kind of unusual. Usually start from the early in your life history, but if we could start like when you first arrived at the University of Florida as a graduate student in 1969, I believe.
Correct.
What was campus like? What was Gainesville like? Like how is it different than now?
I was actually listening for no particular reason, but it struck me to Simon and Garfunkel a couple of days ago when they have the one line that says, "Time it was, oh what a time it was," and that seems like an appropriate thing for the way things were when I arrived here. So it's fall of 1969. I had just to rewind the tape a little bit. I had gone to a private liberal arts college in Louisville, Kentucky, my hometown, called Bellarmine College, now Bellarmine University. Very, very fine, but 2,000 student school, but full liberal arts thing. And so I found myself here in August of 1969 when I drove down from Louisville in a 69 Dodge Monaco, this big tank, and all of my worldly possessions were in half of the trunk because the car was so big. And it was the first time I'd ever set foot in the state of Florida. I honestly, in my heart of hearts, thought there was a beach. Didn't look close enough at the map to realize we were in the center of the state. But so I arrive on this campus and I said, this is big. But actually, it was about 20,000 students at that time. A good part of the campus, which exists now, was not here. Many of the buildings are in what they call the historic campus now. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, and so a lot of the buildings were subsumed right there. So there was no big student union or anything like that. Nevertheless, it felt big to me. We're about 55,000 students now compared to 20,000 then, but it was growing. So my first thought was, it's big, but it's very, very different from my undergraduate school, which was socially quite active, and I was engaged with that. I was student government president at my undergraduate school, and so there was a lot of things going on at the time there. About Vietnam, about integration, Black Power issues, and related kinds of civil rights sorts of issues. And what I found was when I came here is that it was similar but bigger and more. There was tremendous energy. There was energy flowing that it's hard to put your finger on, but it was flowing in so many different directions at the time. I mean, we were coming off of some things that we can talk about perhaps later. But all these sort of movements were converging in the late 60s and early 70s. So certainly Vietnam had come to a head, and there was a growing sense of we really need to get out of there, and this is not going well, and perhaps we shouldn't be there. Black Power was a big issue, again with a big history here, because Florida really only University of Florida only really began admitting students, Black students at the undergraduate level several years earlier. I mean, so it was basically a new thing in 1969, and there were very few of them, much to the displeasure of the Black students who were here. So Vietnam, Black Power, faculty union having just gotten organized in 1968 after a number of years, but still didn't have a collective bargaining agreement. So while the union was in existence, the CBA had not come into existence yet. And so there were a lot of things going on around that. And there were still hangover from something that happened. And again, we can decide if we talk about it, a thing called the Johns Commission, which was leading to lots of violations of student and faculty rights around homosexuality, as it was referred to then, with people being frog walked out of classrooms in front of everyone, both students and faculty alike. But there were other issues around faculty being dismissed on the basis of speaking out publicly in favor of integration, which was not a popular stance here in the administration of the university. So Vietnam, Black Power, integration, feminism was also a big deal. And Florida, University of Florida, has been repeatedly pointed out as one of the places that was one of the sort of 5 central locations nationwide for talking about feminism. And in fact, I'm just trying to think of the women's names. Beverly Jones and Judith Brown wrote a manifesto called Toward a Female Liberation Movement, which became a kind of a guideline nationally. So this was a real center of that. So put all these things together: feminism, Vietnam, anti-war, integration, still new, Black Power, still underrepresented, faculty union, all of this stuff was coming to a head, and all of these things kind of glommed together. But there was this sense of energy on the campus pushing all these things and bringing them together and making people feel of common cause. I can only say it took my breath away.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have talked to many people who were in Gainesville or on campus at UF or both, Steve, and you've given actually the best synopsis of the overall, kind of geopolitical reality and campus reality of that time. I mean, generally people kind of think about where they were if they were a part of a movement, but you kind of given a wonderful overview. Well, let me ask you something, kind of a question as a person who was also a grad student at one point. Were you able to participate in any of the kind of movement activities, or were you really kind of locked down with your graduate studies?
I probably should have been more locked down with my graduate studies, but no, I got pretty caught up in it. I mentioned I was involved in student government back in Louisville. I was involved in organizing a number of sort of major demonstrations in the city, marches. Got to know the FBI got to know me, I think, because when we were going along, they had these cars who would keep zooming up and guys in suits jumping out with cameras and taking our pictures. And if we signed a petition in the front of the really radical things, lots of people turned out, but it was calm, marching on sidewalks from the campuses down to the federal building downtown and signing a petition in the case of Vietnam to say things like, we strongly encourage the government to reevaluate its position and strategy in Vietnam. That was radical. Yeah. But everyone who was signing it, they took a picture of you signing it and then a picture of you. So we were involved in that, and I kind of brought that along with me. I had been involved in integration issues in Louisville since high school days. So I kind of merged into it. So I juggled both of them, but I just couldn't imagine not being part of all these other movements because there was passion. around all of these things. There was a sense of some things happen. Well, again, back to my music, the Youngblood, something's happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. The other song line is what you felt here. You sense something was going on, and I wanted to be a part of it.
Yeah. Well, how, you know, as a person who already had been involved in movement, kind of freedom movement activity, how was the milieu in Gainesville and UF? Like, how did it compare to Louisville? Like, was it similar? Was it different? Like you mentioned, the struggle for integration, and I know there was struggles in both places, but it seems like there may have been differences.
Well, I'd say even compared to now, it. I don't want to say it was violent, but it was certainly much more expressive. I mean, it was. We were kind of Southern gentlemen and nuns and things like that, and it was the things we engaged in back in Louisville was very calm. Here, I would say I've already said the energy level was very high, but I think the ability to really challenge and make noise and offend people and maybe throw things sometimes was at a much higher level, and it was increasing during that very first year that I was here. It started off relatively calm, but sort of began to escalate, particularly as the Vietnam and the Black Power things seemed to come together and feel of common cause in a way. So
Mhm.
the likelihood of actively, I don't want to use the word violently, but to actively taunt and you know and speak out and confront, I guess confront's a better word, uh, police, administrators, uh, government agencies, and so forth. It was much more aggressive here.
Yeah.
I was
And
surprised by
how,
that, and I felt I had that took some accommodating for me, but I didn't really. I was never on the really confrontational side. I felt like our cause seemed so right and proper that I couldn't believe that they didn't believe it.
Mhm. Well, what about student government? And again, I'm looking for, you know, maybe comparison and contrast. So, you know, you're obviously in Louisville, you're a student, you go to UF and you're now a graduate student. What was the kind of the campus, like the student milieu in terms of activism? If you can kind of dial into that and maybe think about some of the comparison and contrasts between UF and Louisville.
Well, as I said, there were about 20,000 students overall. If you looked at any given demonstration, a really big one would be 2,000, so 10%. So that means that 90% of the people weren't there, at least physically.
No.
So it was a core of people who were you'd recognize the same people who were showing up at the demonstrations. The student government, the fellow, as I recall, and I don't recall his name after 50 years, more than 50. Gotta look it up. But what was active, and for example, when it came to the Black Power and integration and all the things that revolved around that, was quite active in speaking out. So the student government did take a role, but it was pretty organic in terms of how a lot of these things got organized. There were a core of people who would put things together and say, here's when it's going to happen, and when to show up and get the posters out and all that sort of thing. But the student government, while it still played its more conventional role, was not shy about being in the front of this, as I recall. And uh, the religious groups also were very active at that time. So, for example, the Catholic Student Center, where I had some involvement, I was sang in the folk group of all things. Um, but there was a guy named Mike Gannon, who was the pastor at that time, who ultimately left the priesthood, but was a very distinguished history professor here. I suspect you knew him. Uh,
Yeah.
so, and he often served in a mediating kind of role. So student government was there. They were not standing back and letting just activists do it, but I would say they were not the point people in making it all happen.
Right. Speaking of Mike Gannon, Steve, you see that sign behind you, the Gehring's bookstore sign. and it owes its existence at Spot to Mike Gannon. One day I was walking by the store. It had already been sold. We lamented it. We faculty used it for years and years for our book orders. And so after it had been sold, it was being remodeled, and there was a contractor inside and painting or divoting or whatever. And I saw the sign, the Sacred Gearing's bookstore sign just sitting in the, and I went into the store and I introduced myself and I asked about the sign. And this contractor was so excited because he said, "Oh, at UF, I was a Mike Gannon student. I love Professor Gannon." So I explained to him that we could preserve the sign at UF, and he was overjoyed. And he said, "Please take the sign. It's otherwise it would have been thrown out." So Mike Gannon made so many connections for us.
That's the key. You asked earlier about what, the transition from Louisville to coming here and what was the experience like. Thinking about something like that, I think sort of defined the space as well. If I had to contrast it with right now, here, 2025, you get more of a corporate sense here, whether it's the names of the buildings or the buildings themselves or how the business is being done, or if you walk down University Avenue, for anyone who happens to know Gainesville, University Avenue, as it is in many college towns, kind of a main drag. And at the time, back in the 1960s, it was marked by some of the religious centers, the Lutherans, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Catholics, the Hillel. I guess it was Hillel then, but it was the Jewish student organization. Each had places right lining the street. But in the middle, along for, I'm going to say, a good six or seven blocks, were little shops and bookstores and small restaurants and coffee. Coffee wasn't as big a deal then. It was a deal, but nothing like now. But it was all these little independent stores. So it had much of a more of a small town feel. So it was, now it's high rises with, chain store fronts and so forth. Like I said, it has more of a corporate feel. But back then, I think this is important because it shaped how whether the demonstrations, where students lived, they lived in in places that were known as the hippie ghetto at that point, which were these ramshackle buildings. Literally, these things were falling apart. But you'd have a bunch of people piled in there, and it was little frame buildings and little side streets and so forth. The only high rise to be seen was a thing called the Siegel Building, which is downtown, which is about, 10 stories tall, and that was the only tall building in town. The bell tower here on campus was here, but everything else was smaller scale but intimate. And I think that defined the kind of relationships that people had and what the tenor of the times was, and how things, if it was a demonstration, they came together in a kind of an organic sort of way. At least this is my interpretation. It's what it felt like. They just had, it wasn't like you had to have a lot of organization and committees and stuff like that. They just came together because things revolved around this small space. No one had cars. So you could connect with one another. That you weren't living at apartment complexes that were, 6 miles away. It was all revolved right around the central campus. So if there was a demonstration, you didn't have to do much more than walk across the street and you were in it.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you, Steve, if you could describe for us, maybe a few demonstrations that really stick out in your mind. But first, you had mentioned, Bev Jones, and I'm actually on my way to the Labor and Working Class History Association annual meeting in Chicago this week. And there's a panel on Florida education, including our colleague, Robert Casanello, UCF, who's been a union officer at the UCF chapter at UFF for many years. And his paper is, his paper is kind of more recent collective bargaining history in the system in Florida. But there's another very fascinating paper about kind of Bev Jones and Marshall Jones and kind of their kind of dual activism in some ways, how it it overlapped, and sometimes it was distinct. From Pensacola to Gainesville. They've been in Pensacola before Gainesville many years. And of course, when you arrived, it was kind of right after the his tenure case, right? And I wonder if you could talk about that, and maybe if you heard any rumblings about that by the time you got to campus. It had been a public kind of cause celeb, but it may have died down by 69. I can't remember exactly.
Yeah. I don't think that one didn't form a central portion. This place was still vibrating a bit from a lot of the faculty rights, anti-homosexual, sort of purging a sense that the legislature was coming in to set the university right and to get rid of all these people who were either too much into this integration thing or were too gay, which was not a term being used at the time, even though it was right around Stonewall and all that happening in New York and so forth. But I would say the aftershocks were there more than the particular cause itself at that time. So it was, and so people were feeling the sense of rights being violated and control being exerted from outside. And it's without getting out of the timeline here, it's eerily similar to what's being felt, what I feel, what I think a lot of people feel right now, as there's this sense that somehow or other the university has gone astray, and it's up to the legislature and the governor and the administration and so forth to pull us back onto the straight and narrow, and to do it in ways which violate people's rights and so forth. And the students felt really strongly about that. Because remember, I mean, as you said, it's Vietnam is really coming to a head, and people have now realized how many people died. So we have demonstrations where you could buy an armband that had 644,000 on it, which was the number of U.S. casualties at that particular point in the Vietnam War. And it was our brothers, in this case, who are being pulled off the campus and drafted and sent over there. So there was this sort of intimate connection with it. But I would say that the case that you brought up was there, but it was in that sort of merger of feeling like there's this establishment who feels like we are being naughty children, and also communist or gay or whatever it was, something bad, and that they had to set it right, and we weren't going to stand for that on various fronts, whether it was feminism or anti-war or Black Power or all those kinds, or academic freedom issues. They all felt to be of a whole, but the climate was such that we said we've just been through this, and now we're having to fight this battle again, but we'll fight it again.
Yeah.
And that became a rallying source.
Well, yeah, you're talking, it sounds to me, you're talking really about both, local, statewide, and national currents that have a profound effect. During your time as a student in the late 60s, of course, Clark Kirk is the governor. He campaigns on his way to become the Florida governor, in part on he's going to discipline the educators. He's going to set them right. They're going to do something about this tenure thing. He's not going to raise taxes. And then he gets caught up in the 1968 Florida teachers strike. Right. And that has an enormous impact. He does end up raising taxes. He's not very happy about it, but the Florida educational system, the K through 12 system, is in such dire straits. In part, that's really what animates the strike. And then you also alluded to the national and international when you talk about Black Power, the Vietnam War. And so it's kind of, you're describing like a maelstrom in some ways. What was it?
There were demonstrations every week, and sometimes multiple times a week. I mean, it was literally, it wasn't like it would be every 2 months. It was every single week.
Every single week. Describe some of the demonstrations that you still think about or that were kind of memorable.
Okay, well, let me pick sort of one of the first ones. Was right after I got here. I looked it up because I was trying to be sure that my memory was, was right. But I knew it was the first. It was shortly after I came. Um, but there was one called Gentle Wednesday, to give you an idea. How about that? That sounds radical, doesn't it? That was on October the 15th. So, right at pretty much the beginning of the semester. And it was right out here on, for anyone who doesn't know the campus, a place called the Plaza of the Americas. It is a big open plaza in front of the main library, liberal arts library. And about 1,800 is what, somewhere in the range of 1,800, 2,000 people turned up, which is a lot. Again, out of a campus which had a total of 20,000, and not all, a significant number of those were grad students who, as you said, may be really caught up in their studies. But it was it was the one where we had the armbands and things like that, and it was a Gentle Wednesday. But one, and I don't have the date for it, but I believe it was in 71. Well, Kent State happened in 1970 when the students were shot at Kent State in Ohio. And the students came together on that, and the student government was very much in that. The student demanded that the then president, O'Connell, that he should call off classes. He only agreed to have a day of mourning, which was in May, which was short. It was just within days after the Kent State thing happened. But he refused to call off classes. But thousands of students walked out of class in any case. I remember the walkout. That's one. But again, it was peaceful. We just stayed away, and people rallied together and had speakers and held signs and things like that. But a later demonstration that I was in, we lived on a house on 15th Street, which people who know the place would know exactly where it is. It just one block down from campus. And this was one where the energy was now building up, and people nationally and locally were really get upset about it. And this was focused on, on Vietnam. So let me paint the picture for you. There are hundreds, I'll say, maybe 1,000 students scattered around, known at the time as hippies, although it was pretty tame hippies around Gainesville. But so they're up and down the street on the part which is most joins the campus. There is a line of police who have now been called out because they decided we're doing this too much. There are too many demonstrations. It's too disruptive, and we need to show students what's happening. So you have local police lined up in riot gear with the big batons and helmets and stuff like that. They had something which would be like a forerunner of a Humvee, but it was some sort of armored vehicle that they put some metal plating on the outside, and it had kind of grenade launcher tubes that came out the side and the front and the back. And so they could fire tear gas things out of this thing. And they had it rigged up with loudspeakers or something, so it made this loud buzzing noise. So it was supposed to scare you. It looked pretty scary. So they're there, but also coming in and coming right down the street in front of our little house, the ones I was describing earlier, were all these guys in red pickup trucks coming from the surrounding area, carrying baseball bats, clubs, and chains. And I don't know if I can say this here, but they were coming by, and we were sitting on our porch. We said, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" He said, "We're going to go whoop ourselves some hippie ass." And I said, "Well, this sounds like probably not a very good thing to do," but I couldn't resist. So I walked the 1.5 blocks down to University Avenue, and I'm in the middle of this crowd. Well, the police suddenly decide they're going to clear it. They're standing at 13th and University, major intersection for people who don't know if they're listening to this. And they start marching kind of at a jog pace. Now, these guys were not in the best of shape, the police. They were sort of round, and it was in spring. It was as warm and humid as it is very many days here. So you've got this Humvee thing buzzing its way down and launching tear gas out to the side, and the police coming along, and some of them had tear gas guns as well. There's a place which is now a Chipotle, restaurant, but at the time was a Crystal hamburger place. And there were people in there eating. So the police throw some tear gas grenades into the restaurant. The hippies are all jumping up and down and say, "Hey, pigs, come get me," and laughing and so forth. And as the police would come forward, they would go down the side streets or onto the campus. Well, campus one side, hippie ghetto on the other side. And the police were chasing some of them, but mainly keeping their phalanx of people coming down the street, following the buzz machine. They come into the library, which is right behind where I'm sitting now. They throw tear gas into the library as well. They're starting to drag people off. So anyway, they run all the way down to the football stadium, which is about 5 blocks. By then, all the hippies have gone out to the side streets. And as they pass and go to there, the hippies all come back out into the streets and start jumping up and down again and say, "Hey, pigs, come get us." And so the guys turn around and they come back, and it's again led by the buzz machine and more tear gas. They do this 3 times. In fact, by now, the cops are getting really tired. And so it was kind of a hoop, but I remember that one very well. Because it had this kind of sense of comedy about it, comedy, and the comedy, not comity, although I suppose it has some of both. But it was kind of a party, but it was really serious, and some people got hurt in the process. But it went on for an extended period of time with this back and forth. I remember that one. I remember this date very well because it was called Black Thursday. It was April the 15th, 1971. This one was all around Black Power because the Black Student Union at that point had gotten very engaged. And again, it would still overlap with the Vietnam stuff. But they felt that the university was not doing enough to integrate, which it wasn't. I think there were about 50 or 60 Black students in all of the campus. And the Black students wanted to do more. And because these movements had come together, people participated. So there was again a demonstration centered at 13th and University, was started actually on Plaza of the Americas, marched over to Tigard Hall, which is the administration building where President O'Connell, Stephen C. O'Connell's office was. And they marched in and wanted to come see O'Connell. Well, he wouldn't see them. After a bunch of time, they finally gave up, but then ended up coming back and occupying it again. And he starts threatening he's going to arrest people. And they had, it was somewhere over 60 were arrested. But the demonstration started getting ugly. So at that main intersection, 13th University, the police, for example, did not want to be photographed. And they dragged a reporter, a reporter who was in his car, a reporter for the Gainesville Sun, who was also a reporter photographer. And they dragged him out of his car and beat the hell out of him at 13th and University with people watching. Well, that inflamed the crowd. So back to Tigard Hall and refusing to leave. And that's when they started arresting the students with under threat of expulsion. They had 2 city buses that they brought in to take them down to jail. And so the students, and I happened to be in the group, I didn't actually do it, I was more watching but I was part. The students let the air out of the tires on the buses so they couldn't move them. And we thought that was pretty funny. So they got the students on the bus, but they couldn't take them anywhere. And so that really got the cops irritated. And so they started doing their own club swinging and so forth. So that one turned pretty ugly, but it ended up in demonstrations. It's not worth going into all the details, but another demonstration which ended up marching to President O'Connell's home, and about 1,000 students staying in front of that, and also a month-long encampment on the front lawn of Tigard Hall, demanding action on both faculty and student, increasing the enrollment from 60, for example, to something like 400 students, and a comparable increase in terms of the Black faculty, because faculty were being dismissed. By the way, Stephen C. O'Connell his predecessor, J. Wayne Wrights, who have large buildings named after them on campus, as you well know, were both, I will say it, racist. One of the demands for O'Connell was that he resign from the Gainesville Country Club, which was exclusively and proudly all white at the time. I suppose you could get in if you were black, if you were part of the help staff or something like that.
Yeah.
But there were no members, but he was proud of that. And during his time before being here at the university, had been the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and had actively opposed virtually anything that had to do with integration, even after Brown versus Board of Education and so forth. So his position on the Black Power issues was pretty clear. And so that was one that you had a kind of a target here on campus. It was hard to target him as being something for Vietnam, but he had something he could do about it here. So I think that escalated that. So those two particular ones stuck out in my mind. But I think it was more the repeated nature of one. I mean, there was a large demonstration, hundreds to thousands of people every single week, sometimes multiple times a week. There was that level of engagement, and that was what compelled me.
Yeah. So all the time that you're participating in these demonstrations, Steve, I almost forgot to ask you the obvious. I mean, you're a grad student at the time. What were you like studying? What was that transition like in starting, a PhD program? Yeah.
Well, of course, it was much. It was less structured. We did have a thing that was kind of a core thing we called I forget the name for it. But it was like it was a required seminar for all the incoming first year grad students. It was kind of like a compendium of what's the latest stuff happening in the wonderful world of psychology this year. And so you'd have a 6-week chunk of time so that everybody had a kind of a common grounding. So that was the one thing that kind of structured your life. You had to do that. And it was demanding. I mean, there were a lot of late nights and things like that, doing things. You had to work the demonstrations into that. But it was doable. Everything looked very different. The psychology department at the time is in an area which is now a combination of Little Hall and the parking lot which adjoins Little Hall. But it was a World War I barracks that had been disassembled from Camp Blanding, which is in Stark, Florida, near here, and reassembled here on campus. And that was the psychology department. It's set up on these stone little pillar things. But it was wooden. It was not air conditioned. There was, I think, a window unit air conditioning in the office. Heavily termite infested. No graduate student offices. No computers except for one mainframe, which you would typically have if you could get time on the mainframe. It would be like at 4:30 in the morning, is when you could get your time. So it was a whole lot more organic at the time. But my master's thesis advisor was a guy named Norm Markle, who passed away a couple of years ago. He was in linguistics, and my master's thesis ended up being in linguistics with Norm as being my master's thesis advisor, but he also was the first president of the faculty union here. Yeah. So I was there. That was serendipitous that the two of us were together, and then I got involved with trying to get a graduate student union organized. And I have a story to tell, which I hope I am not confabulating. It is very vivid in my mind. You ever have these ones where you've been told something enough that you begin to think it's real? I think this one is real. I got quoted in the Florida Alligator, the student newspaper, a couple of times because I was helping with the graduate student organization. At the same time, the faculty were having just gotten recognized, but didn't have a collective bargaining agreement that was still working around that. And I got called into O'Connell's office. And he had this enormous desk. It looks like the Resolute desk in the White House, something, big wooden desk. And on this desk was, when I came in, I cleaned myself up, put on a coat and tie. Hair was a little long, but everybody's hair was pretty long back then. I was not a hippie. I was more of a preppy. That's just was my style. But in any case, so I put on a coat and tie, and I go in and I see this big desk, and there's three things sitting on it. A big blotter, like you put on wooden desks, so you wouldn't, with your fountain pen, you wouldn't have it leaking through, I guess. A telephone, and a manila folder with some papers in it with my name on it. And that was it. And so we engaged in some small talk about the union, the graduate student union, and back and forth. And it was congenial enough and so forth. I didn't want to go in and just be confident. But he finally gets down to, I guess, what the reason for the meeting was. And he said, Mr. Kirn, do you have to call it a graduate student union? And I said, well, we thought it had a pretty nice ring to it, and we were going to stick with that. And so we went back and forth on that. We ended up kind of agreeing to disagree. It ended up amicably enough. Nothing happened to me bad and so forth. But I vividly remember walking into the office and seeing that and seeing the thing with my name in big font on it. So I was thinking this could be it. So that sort of shaped it. But when nothing happened, nothing happened. And so we just kind of continued on. And I'll grant him that. At least there was no retribution. But, you know, I guess I knew enough that he'd made the point, if he wanted to do something, he could. And we weren't doing anything out of line. We were just saying we want to organize. So,
Yeah.
but I'd say the one going up and down the street, the Black Power one with the occupation of the president's office, those are ones which grabbed me. But also the Gentle Wednesdays, where it was people who came together who were just upset and sad, in addition to being angry. But sometimes the anger was not fully suppressed, but it was, we just felt bad about things, and like it was not working right, and people were getting killed, and we felt awful about it.
Yeah.
There was an underlying sadness.
Right. Well, Steve, you mentioned someone who's very important in both your academic and organizing life. Of course, Norman Markle, and he was a remarkable individual. We would talk about him at United Faculty of Florida and on campus, looking over his kind of political academic biography. Of course, he was your dissertation advisor.
Well, master's. He was my thesis advisor, but not dissertation.
Your thesis advisor. He was also very active in the Democratic Socialists organization, committees of correspondence, progressive Jewish organizations, and of course, as you mentioned, the first statewide president of the faculty union. What kind of impact did he have, on your career? And did you all talk about any of the kind of political stuff, or was it more of a classic, advisor-advisee relationship?
I'd say that in terms of our interactions, it focused on the latter, because as you were saying, you're here in grad school, and now you're not just in school, in undergrad, taking your classes and things like that. Now you're really in it, and you got to do it. So it was pretty business oriented, and I didn't know anything about linguistics, but I got assigned to him, and so I ended up doing a thing in psycholinguistics with him, but which was really tedious and called for a lot of work. But no, we definitely talked about it, and as you said, the socialist group, very much involved in all these kind of planning. There was really kind of a coalition of all these groups who felt of common cause, and I would say Norm. Dr. Markle reflected that in all the things that he said. But I guess he did serve as a role model for me in terms of how you can be, really, focus in. You have your professional work to do it and so forth, but you don't set aside your community responsibility. You don't let the university become an ivory tower. That there was, I guess, the message both in words and in practice that he said to me is that you live in a broader world, and the university has to project itself and bring the values, things like open inquiry and academic freedom, and considering different points of view, and being data-based and fact-based, and having ideologies and so forth, but putting them to the test and insisting that they not just be a cult, but they be something. I give all this stuff away.
Very apt, very apt. No, I mean, to me, Steve, you're talking about the generational differences in politics. And so, when you were becoming an activist, the paramount figures in the Republican universe were debaters. There were people like William Buckley. There were people even like Milton Friedman who loved good debates, right? Now we have to deal with people like Ron DeSantis and Rick Scott and Rubio. They don't want debates. You're wrong and they're right. I loved watching William Buckley, for example. There was a famous debate with him and James Baldwin. And it's such a treat to show it to my students, to have this person, James Baldwin, who was heavily involved in the civil rights movement, nothing in common with William Buckley, but they could have a kind of principled, no hands barred, knockdown, drag out debate in front of students. I think it was at Harvard or something. I mean, you would never see that today. Today would be, the Republican, who's the guy, Mike Johnson, said, tar and feather Governor Newsom in California, arrest him. There's no debate. I mean, it seems like the milieu you're talking about, what Professor Markle is kind of bringing you in some ways, is get your facts down, be an activist, but be principled, the facts matter, right?
Yeah, and it was okay to challenge them. I mean, even, one of the things that would happen when I went to various planning meetings and so forth, and there was a lot of discourse about this. I mean, it wasn't like we came together and everybody was suddenly perfectly unified of everything it is was that we want to do, or where we stand on this issue, or how we should proceed and so forth. There was a lot of, I don't want to say knockdown, drag out, but there was real debate that went on, but there was also a real sense of, but we have an overriding right which we must defend, and it was more, things revolved more around tactics, but there was still even questioning, especially like, how far do you push let's say it's Black power is the issue, and student representation. How fast do you move? How fast can you move? How fast can you suddenly increase the Black professorship at the University of Florida? And what are reasonable kinds of goals? So O'Connell is saying your goals are irrational and unreasonable and unattainable, and so we're not even going to do them. But we're saying, no, that's not good enough. But there was a sense of dialogue. There was at least some level of that. By the way, I got to meet and have dinner with William F. Buckley a few years after that. We had him at Bellarmine, where I went to undergraduate school, as a speaker. Not because Bellarmine was in a William F. Buckley camp. They weren't. They were very much socially active. But we had people like that come in, and the style that you were talking about him with James Baldwin and so forth. I think I've seen clips of that at some point. Was very much the way he was in person. He knew, he figured out pretty quickly, and he and I had kind of different points of view because we sat next to each other at dinner. He taught me how to eat a quail because I had no idea. Never eaten a bird that small. You pick it up. That's what he did, and I figured he would know. But I think that norm was that it was okay to have dialogue. It was okay to doubt. It was okay to wrestle with it, but it was a sense of that was a good thing to do. It says you need to wrestle with these things in yourself. You need to you need to come to understand it, and you need to find your own contradictions in the group that you're working with, or contradictions in what your government's doing, let's say, and it's not always all bad. And you also, with this, my way or the highway kind of approach, just doesn't work very well on a consistent manner. You have to stand for things. That was the message, but you have to find ways to move. And maybe that's just what I ended up with.
Yeah. Well, no, I think there's a change. As a historian, I would say there is a change over time component here, because I remember Bernie Manchin as U.S. president. Bernie and I had a lot of disagreements, and he had disagreements with Sheila. but there were some issues that we got him to move on, and one of them was the issue about undocumented students. He genuinely moved on that issue, and it was so slow, but finally he came out publicly in support of undocumented students, something that I could not imagine in 1,000 years, whoever is going to be president of the University of Florida today. Well, there's another thing, Steve, about one more question about Professor Norm Markle. There is something you said, and I may have lost the thread, but you talked about the importance of connecting the campus to the broader community, the broader world, the reciprocal flows, not an I know, not at he taught, Norm Markle kind of modeled, don't think of it this as the ivory tower. Don't think of us as isolated, kind of above everyone else. I remember there's a story. I mean, I never knew him personally, but there was a story he told, and I've heard this from many different people, that he would reflect back on his own family history. And I don't know much about it except for the fact that apparently, though the story he told was that his father had worked in a factory, an assembly line at some point, and early on, he lost his finger, or fingers were actually cut off in this terrible industrial accident. And then subsequently, his father became a driver. He was a Teamster, worked for on contract with the Teamsters Union for almost 40 years. And Norm Markle would tell that story to kind of remind himself and remind people like where he was from. Like he was only one generation removed from that kind of really rough working class experience. And it seems like it's a way he kind of kept himself grounded so that he didn't think of himself as being in the ivory tower.
Yeah, well, and I guess, my dad was in World War II. He was in the Navy. He was on a PT boat, actually in the same squadron as JFK, turns out. But he came back, as many of the vets did then, and most of them didn't ever have houses before. I was just in Louisville last week for a friend's funeral, and I took my brother, who had never been down to the West End, which is where we started, but they built those little tract houses, like in Levittown, New Jersey, the first real suburb. Yeah. Well, they had these two streets, which was little frame, cookie cutter, two bedroom, one bath houses, and that was the first house. And I remember because people just had apartments before. A lot of them didn't have houses. People who had houses lived out in the country because you had to have a house. But other people lived in different. But they still had that complete foot in that not having had that stuff. And my generation is kind of the transitional one because I'm 78 now, so I was born in 1947, and so I kind of grew up still seeing the vestiges of all that, and people who were just encountering coming into something that came to look like the middle class as we came to know it in the 50s and the golden era of the 60s when everything was booming and people were, making money and having homes and cars and factory, all that stuff was happening. But it has, I think, still a kind of a grounding effect. Now, the students that I was teaching here, if I ever told stories like that, they looked at me like I was from Mars. It just was not part of their life experience, and it was very, very different. But I think it does do what you were alluding to, which is a sense that the university does not and should not stand aside from the community that it exists in and the culture that it lives in and so forth. That it actually has a responsibility to engage with it, but also to invite the community to engage with us as well. And this sort of carving it out as being somehow, we're the pointy-headed intellectuals, as Spiro Agnew used to say, and somehow or other are disdainful of everyone else because they're beneath us and so forth. If you've been too privileged, it becomes easy to do that. To feel like you're the privileged class and to stand aside from it. And even in my teaching, which was in retailing, where you're engaging with all different kinds of people, I try to emphasize that there without preaching. but just to show how the university and whatever you do when you come out of here, whether you're working as a retailer or whatever it happens to be, has to somehow or other be connected. And I think there was still a different kind of a connection that we had then, and certainly because of engagement with things like the war and the Vietnam Vets Against the War was very active here, even at that early. Because that was pretty early when they started getting organized. Sort of probably around 67, I think was 67, 68 is when we started seeing the VVAW group, but they were part of it, and some of them had come back to university. So again, that real world connection, and so you couldn't run away from it. And I feel like that's been lost a little bit now. It's
Yeah.
and that has the same kind of things that give you a governor and people who are so disdainful of university or intellectual challenge and debate and so forth. It's just different.
Yeah. Well, they really see no need for debate because they're right and you're mediocre. It reminds me of a story that was told about Ben Sasse during his short and troubled tenure as president of the University of Florida. A dear colleague of mine was invited to be on a special committee of faculty when Sasse was here. Sasse convened this committee of faculty. He called it something like the Committee of Exceptional Faculty or Faculty Excellence or something. And so they actually had a meeting with Ben Sasse, which was really astonishing because very few faculty or even students even got to meet Sasse when he was here. He rarely showed up for anything. But he showed up for this meeting of faculty excellence. And one of the first questions that was asked of him by a very distinguished faculty at the University of Florida, also a member of NED Faculty of Florida, asked President Sasse, this is a committee on faculty excellence, but, why didn't you go to the faculty senate and raise these issues and these questions so that we could hash them out among, the whole faculty and not just a small group? And Sasse's response was, the faculty that go to the faculty senate meetings are the median. I want to talk to the exceptional faculty. I'm not interested in talking to the median people.
Whoa.
And yeah, I thought that was so indicative of this generation of kind of reactionary leaders. I don't even want to think that that's normal in the Republican Party, but I have my suspicions. But again, it's the anti-Buckley thing. See, William Buckley, I know we have our differences, but let's do a thought experiment. William Buckley becomes president of the University of Florida in 2018 or 19 or 20 or whatever. He would have loved to talk, to debate, to talk, even when he disagreed with you. And he relished those types of activities, whereas Sasse, as far as any of the faculty could understand, was kind of hiding out in the baseball complex quite a bit of the time.
Yeah.
And when it came time to actually give an account of himself to the board of trustees, I believe he said something like, I didn't realize that this job took work. They're the kind of work that you have to talk to people, and he was not interested in talking to people. He wanted to talk at people and tell us, how this is how we're going to revolutionize higher education. And I think he was coddled in that way because he would write a piece for the Atlantic or New York or wherever, and it would be about revolutionizing higher education, but no one ever talked back to him in those pieces. It was all about what he was going to do to wake you and I up to our, or maybe get rid of us. I don't know.
Yeah, it's one of the things which really worries me even now, and that we were talking earlier about how have things changed and so forth. That is really is a serious concern, and I'll be long gone before it ever gets resolved. Is the corporatization of the university, and the corporate model. That's who we idealize now. That's why Elon Musk. You presume that if somebody has made a whole lot of money, then they must also be really, really smart and really, really good at running things. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gotten all this money. Not taking into account that the system is rigged to make sure that certain people get the money,
Right.
and other people don't. But but that's a concern to me. But I think what you were saying about SAS, I never had any interaction. The closest I got to interacting with him was when we were down chanting uh, outside Emerson Hall the first time he showed up on campus to say we don't want you here, or get your SAS out of here, or some kind of sign like that. And
Yeah.
but he exuded that, he was above it. And I think even the things that got him in trouble here, $28,000 sushi bars for one party. Come on. Um,
Yeah.
he's so and can't see what the problem is with that is what I think you're talking about, which is that they are a distinctly different class, and faculty are
Yeah.
they are not among the cognoscenti who they are cognoscenti about whatever their special little part of the world is, but they don't understand the
Yeah.
real world and how we have to run this thing like a business. And but it really worries me. But I see that we keep continuing to go down that path. Uh,
Right.
and now,
Exactly.
we came close to having somebody who I had my own concerns about the president who we had coming in here up until a few days ago. The president who was going to be President Ono. But
Okay.
having that, with the board of trustees unanimously recommending the guy, and then having him deep six within 3 days after that by guys
Yeah.
like Christopher Rufo or Donald Trump Jr. Why does he get a vote on
Right.
this? Uh,
Yeah.
but
Why not the
at
student? Well,
least
yeah. Yeah.
I
Why
don't
not
know
the
if he'd have been
students?
perfect, but at
Yeah.
least he had academic credentials and so forth. And it seemed to me like maybe he would be flexible enough. I
Yeah.
fear what the result is going to be, that we're going to go even farther down that path. But
Yeah.
but but I had some taste of it here as a student, and then as a faculty member, and seeing how it was happening. But I'm seeing the move towards the corporate model, and
Yeah. Exactly.
I don't think that's good.
Well, well, Steve, I wanted to, I know we've gone way over an hour, but I wanted to ask you maybe two or three more questions, and then we can kind of use those for a follow-up interview, maybe a bit later this month or this summer. But so one of the questions is, so you finish your MA, working with Norm Markle. Can you talk a little bit about how you matriculate to your PhD and kind of what your focus on was for your dissertation?
Well, I was part of what I was doing. I was able that the psych department let me kind of construct what my class and related things were, and I took more classes than what I needed to. So one of the things I got was a certificate in urban studies, and had classes. We have one class that was taught by a sociologist, an economist, and a psychologist, and an urban planner. We had three or four people, but it talked a lot about social and cultural issues and so forth, and how those things overlap. So, and one of the things I worked on as kind of a service thing that we did at the time was putting together what we have the same problem we have with migrant farm workers now, uh, who follow the crops, but it was worse back then. I'm telling you, in terms of the conditions that they worked on. But they would, be in South Florida, and pick the stuff that came in, and or in December and January, and then they'd move up to Central Florida as the strawberries and the tomatoes and stuff, and kind of moving. But they were moving their families along as well. And so but the students would come and they would put them in the school, and the schools were supposed to take them, but they would literally arrive with no papers or anything. So the kids would show up, and you're a second grade teacher, and suddenly you'd have this kid in the classroom, and you don't know anything about him. You don't know what his language skills are, whether he can read, what it happens to be. So we're trying to put together in a pre-computer time where you could make it easy to do the track, relatively easy to do tracking, a paper trail, so that when the kid showed up, he could walk in and have a file and say, my name is Jose, and here's what I get. Here's my reports from my previous teacher, where I was for 6 weeks, and it could move with them along the way. So I got involved with that, and that got me interested in what ultimately ended up being my dissertation, which was the intersection of healthcare and accessibility to it. And to just compress the story, I had submitted something on a different topic where I had a horrible experience where I came in and we were setting up the final review defense of the dissertation proposal and so forth. So I had my 5 committee members, 2 of whom had to be outside psychology, and I had one chair who was the head of the clinical psych department. And I'd gone through all the revisions, trying to satisfy 5 people who could not all be simultaneously satisfied, but I had to hit the accommodating position. So they all got good enough to where they say, yes, we're ready to have the meeting. And that my chair did it. And so we have a 2-hour meeting, and they're all firing the questions and challenging my statistics and my sample of the subjects and all the usual stuff. How I was going to do the stats, and my chair is not saying anything. And finally gets to the end, and the other guys start looking at their watch, and like everybody's kind of finished. And so my chair asked them, any more questions? Anybody? And they're all saying, no, we're good. And so he sits back in his chair and says, as this proposal stands, it is not dissertation material, and got up and walked out of the room. Yeah. And left 2 days later for Japan for 6 months.
Whoa. So
it was pretty much not salvageable. And so I had to generate an entirely new dissertation proposal. But by then, my wife and I my wife, were leaving to go to St. Louis for a required year-long supervised clinical internship in a mental health center. So I ended up doing my dissertation from St. Louis. But fundamentally, what it was looking at a particular personality variable, which is locus of control. It's whether you feel like you are in control of what happens to you. It's not that there's not chance or luck or things like that, but fundamentally what happens to you is your own business, is your own result, versus somebody who says, what happens to me, it's fate, it's God's will. Whatever happens is going to happen. There's nothing much I can do about it. One is called an internal locus of control. I'm in charge. One is it's fate, chance, powerful others, and so forth. My research question was, how would that affect healthcare seeking and outcomes? In other words, does what I believe happen to be, does it make me more or less likely to go see the doctor? At what point do I do that? And I ended up doing it at a place called the Labor Health Institute in St. Louis, which is these several high-rise buildings with a complete comprehensive medical complex right at the base. All you do is get on the elevator and go there, and you can see any kind of physician you wanted. And it was in affiliation with St. Louis University and Washington Med School and so forth. And it was all free. So there was no cost barrier. There was no transportation barrier. You lived right there, and there was no access barrier. So all those variables were held constant. So then I could look at what happened in terms of, but what became important was understanding how the context affects things which we think of as being medical issues, but they really exist in a social milieu, which probably has a whole lot more to do with it than does some of these other things. As it happened when we were in St. Louis, they also had one of those 500-year floods. Well, they had it when we were there. And so St. Charles, Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis, was underwater for like 6 weeks. And my wife and I ended up becoming, to a certain extent, national experts on the emotional after effects of natural disasters. People weren't thinking about that much then. So we ended up doing work for the Red Cross. If there was like a tornado in Omaha, we'd be on an airplane within 3 hours, flying out there and working with the caregivers. But again, it was understanding how these things that seem like they are concrete, unavoidable sorts of things are intimately tied up to psychology. And so that sort of is how I got shaped. But it only happened because my prof walked out on me at my dissertation proposal. I would have never done it. But it really ended up shaping my career afterwards. And while I ended up in business settings, it was in human resource, leadership development, how people learn and grow inside organizations, and optimizing people's ability to do that, and being able to demonstrate concretely that if we did that for the people, that it worked for the institution as well. And so co-wrote an article for Harvard Business Review and so forth, which is still pretty popular, showing how what you do with your employees and how they feel about connecting to the institution that they're working for shapes whether or not your institution makes money. Because they have to make money. But,
Yeah,
but,
right,
but,
exactly.
but all those things came together. And I think as I reflect on it, it kind of shaped the way I feel about being involved in organizations here on campus, like the union. Uh, it is a vital, viable union of people who feel represented and who feel empowered and who feel engaged and cared about and respected and so forth is exactly the kind of people that you want. And I can demonstrate it in business organizations, and I believe it to be true in um, in places like a university. And one of the things, and I'll shut up, that of going over and doing lobbying over in Tallahassee and finding that legislators just literally think that faculty are the enemy. And increasingly in what's happening across the state right now, there is disdain for people who are coming to jobs like presidents of universities. It's happened at FIU. It's happened at New College. I'm afraid it's going to happen here. It happened at FSU now. Even though they had three pretty qualified people for the president, they put in somebody who was a political hack because they think that faculty can't be trusted to run a university. It's up to the
Yeah.
politicians. So I think that is misguided, and I feel this compulsion to be engaged with pointing out how there are better ways.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Steve, I think that really sets us up for our next interview. I'm going to just the last question I'll ask you is, if there are other, any kind of summaries or things that you wanted to talk about now, before our next conversation. But I think for our next conversation, what I'd like to learn more about is, of course, once you finish your dissertation, and your career in working in businesses. I'm especially interested now, of course, because I'm a professor in an ILR school where HR and organizational behavior, collective bargaining, they all kind of come together in many ways. So I'm really interested in that, and I'm also interested in our next interview about your kind of pathway back into, I mean, I know you never left completely intellectual academia, but your pathway back to the University of Florida and your time also as really becoming one of the real leaders in the United Faculty of Florida. And of course, the earlier campaigns that you and I worked on, but also now what you're working on now with recertification, things like that. So that's just kind of a litany or laundry list of things for our next conversation. But I mean, for now, though, I mean, are there things you wanted to talk about or kind of sum up as we kind of start to close
As
down?
I thought about it, no, I think we touched on it. I think that the main theme that I wanted to have is the sense of energy and engagement and the coming together of all these different threads, whether but that had commonalities that had to do with empowerment and engagement and caring, uh, and feeling a responsibility as citizens to not just watch this thing and leave it up to the politicians or leave it up to the captains of industry or whatever to solve it, but rather to well, I said the word already, to engage with it and be a part of it, and that is actually sort of thrilling, and that and I think we talked about that probably enough. So, your sense, I'd be glad to talk some more. I'll tell you that probably the bottom line is going to be is that my sort of working or life, studying, working career probably makes a whole lot more sense in retrospect than it does in prospect. I don't know that I could have ever predicted it.
Right,
But that is part of what the learning is, and it's one of the things
right.
I tell students who think they're going to, go into finance and, be an analyst on Wall Street and it'll all be done. Well, guess what? Now there's AI. Watch out for that entry level job.
Yeah, a lot of pathways got closed down or changed pretty radically.
Yeah. So sure, we could talk about that, and I'd like to do it. I hope I didn't ramble on too much today.
No, no, it was awesome. Steve, I learned so much, and I really appreciate, especially learning a lot, so much more about. There's this critical period. I mean, a lot of the stuff. Marshall Jones had his piece, Berkeley Gainesville, Berkeley, the South piece, which people use a lot, but it's really referring to that a few years earlier and kind of coming in the early 60s. And we have a lot of narratives from faculty who came to UF in the kind of the mid late 50s and saw these changes, but where we go off the deep end starting around 1969, 1970. There's just it's almost as if, well, that's past, the movement is kind of eclipsed now. And so, I mean, you help fill in a lot of details that are going to really be helpful, I think, for future researchers. And like I said, I think this panel I'm going to chairing in Chicago, I'll ask the person who's giving the paper that's talking about kind of the founding of the faculty union. I think it would be nice to put the two of you in contact because there's some details there. She talks about Norman Markle, but kind of more, the paper is really more about Bev and Marshall Jones. And it's very, again, it kind of, the story stops pretty crisply in 68, 69. And then, of course, he leaves for Penn State. And again, there's kind of this vacuum almost. We know history never stops. It continues. So